The use of bodies and things is my topic, and what I would like to do today is first of all contextualize what is, if you like, the logic of inquiring into what I call the use of bodies and things, following, of course, the work of the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. However, before I get to Agamben's genealogy of the notion of use and give you what I hope will be a useful context for your work at the studio with Aristide, I think another pretext, if you like, to this attempt at explaining this to you in the way that I possibly can is, of course, the protocols work that we did with Aristide. So I would like to contextualize a number of aspects of this, as well as provide you with Giorgio Agamben's genealogy and thinking over the notion of use. Why should anyone care? Why is use a notion? I wouldn't say a concept. A notion, a term that we use. You see the self-reference immediately. And why do we focus on it? In the protocols, as you know, by even a cursory look at the work, we use the notion of common use as the aim of the protocols. The protocols being, if you like, a device, a fiction, through which we attempt to install a sort of paralegal or beside the law type of apparatus through which we can have a framework for enacting certain situations architecturally and socially, politically and so forth speaking. But what is it when we say common use that we actually mean? And this is very frequently misunderstood, I think, for a number of reasons that I'll try to unpack as I get on, and I look forward to our discussion in the later live part of this session, so that perhaps I can answer your questions on this. Now, let's establish, sort of put on the table the general conceptions of use that we are all, in one way or another, accustomed to. Use is thought in relation to institutions, institutional frameworks, of which predominant is law, mostly in terms of having the right to use something. Yeah. So, you don't use someone else's car without permission. You don't stay at someone else's house without authorization or permission, or through some kind of legal arrangement, whether it is rent or Airbnb or something of the sort. So you see immediately how what I will eventually perhaps talk about in relation to what we can call the juridification of life, of living, the fact that law is a dominant discourse and formality through which we determine what can be done and what cannot be done and how it can be done. The language of rights in particular translates the mere act of using something into a legal formality. Right? And I say mere act because, of course, what is presupposed, and this is very much at the essence of what I am trying to explain to you today, and with you, I hope in conversation a bit later, is that we presuppose when we say I have the right to use this motorcycle, we presuppose the fact, as a matter of fact, that the mere act of using the motorcycle is inseparable from having the right to use it. In other words, we split the action that I'm actually undertaking, the use of the motorcycle, into the fact of using it, the physical fact of riding a motorcycle, and the legal form of the action, in other words, having or not having the right to use it. Right? Now, this is important to us because, as I will explain historically and in the genealogical work of Giorgio Agamben's work, this is precisely what is at stake. We have conceived of action, at least in the Western imaginary, as we say, as something that is split as a matter of fact and as a matter of right. The right to use something presupposes that there is such a thing as the mere factual act of using it. It is the ground upon which the language of law, if you like, represents, literally speaking, reality, right? And dresses it up in its juridical dress or form. We think of use economically and also morally, given the prevalence of utilitarianism after a certain point in early modernity, according to the logic of utility. So we very much associate using something in relation to what it is useful for. So in other words, a purposeful use, and if we extend this to the ideology of utilitarianism, a use for which a good enough utility for the majority of people would be the outcome of using something. Now, of course, in political economic terms, this utilitization of things is pregnant itself with presuppositions about the nature and the purpose of the things that we use. The classic example of this, of course, is what we call, at least in some parts of the world, as nature, the natural environment, and how we understand it in a utilitarian sense as essentially a resource, a matter at hand that can be placed in reserve for our use or utilitization, right, and effectively exploitation. We also think in terms of the day-to-day political economy of things, of use as consumption. In fact, it is very interesting, I think, and this will relate also, although I will not have time to focus on this later on, in regard to the medieval episode of the genealogy that Giorgio Agamben has offered us in his work, that perhaps one could say every action is now a consumption. And I mean this not only in the sense of the fact that consumerism has become prevalent, and very often the user, and we'll come to this also in relation to architecture, is a consumer, and the user and the consumer are often, including in the built environment, identical or rendered identical, but also in the sense that consumption has a very ancient, or at least medieval, although I think one could safely say it goes all the way back to the late classical Roman period. Consumption is a modality of use, or at least originally consumption, as is common, I think, already today to us, to think of consumption in terms of, say, eating. So when you eat a fruit, you are effectively consuming the fruit. But what this originally meant is that you're actually destroying, through the use of the thing itself. If I eat an apple, I destroy it, I abuse it. Abusus in Latin, and I'll turn to this in a moment very briefly when I speak to you about the root of this problem in classical Roman law, is effectively a modality of use. So in a way, the state in which we find ourselves today, with this, I think it's fair to say, excessive consumerism that in part has also led to the degradation of the planetary environment, as you know, has its roots also in the way in which we have understood or defined the act of using, an aspect of which, not all aspects of which, are related to abusus, to abuse in the sense of the distraction of the thing that one is using. Yeah? Now, not of course everything can be destroyed through its use. I'm referring to a particular case of uses, but you understand where I'm coming from with this. Finally, use is indissociable, it seems to me today, with work, with labor, right? In the same way that using something is attached to a right to use it, and potentially to a purpose, to a utility, and utilitarianism suggests that there is also a justifiable purpose, not just any purpose, something that is politically, economically, morally, socially, and so forth, justifiable, acceptable, permissible, if you like, but also in terms of using something in the manner of acting with or in relation to something, the predominant form of which action is production, work, labor. And perhaps we can come to that in discussion later on. Now, of course, and this is interesting today because in the last 15, 20 years, to use only the most recent examples, there are also counter moves to this understanding of use as a matter of, strictly speaking, right or utility or consumption or work. And you know of these, you've come across them, and they are taking place still today. We refer to common use in the protocol's work in order to signify something that is non-exclusive, right? So it is, when something is placed into common use, the idea is that it is available in a non-exclusive manner. In a way, this flies in the face of, or stands in opposition to, the idea of appropriation. When you appropriate something, you render something into your own property, you're effectively making it of exclusive use. You are, of course, familiar with the political economic term use value that in the work of Karl Marx becomes crucial in explaining the sort of pseudo-dialectic between use value and exchange value, upon which profitability, utility, and exploitation in the capitalist economy takes place. But you know also of long-standing movements of communism or neo-communism, anarchism and neo-anarchism, and of course a number of social movements that range from squatting as an anti-property rights movement, anti-consumerist movements of various kinds, and most recently the anti-work movement. All are, of course, offshoots of a leftist sort of critical ideological program, and all are in one way or another undergoing various transformations, whether in the popular imagination or that of the academic side of things, the critical theory and its development. And all this, I think, is at stake in our protocols project, if not explicitly then implicitly, And it is also, of course, at stake in Giorgio Agamben's work and interest. Now, you are very familiar with the notion of use in those terms, and I'm not going to take you through all of these, because in architectural discourses, you have defined the user in particular ways, whether it is in a functional sense or in the sense of, if you like, the user as a shareholder in the built environment, whether in terms of cultural heritage or in terms of explicit marketing adaptation of the built environment, but also in the very consumerist logic of the user of a built environment in the sense of the unhinged consumer, which perhaps is familiar to you, and also more critical uses, whether it is through the cooperative movement, where the user of a building, for example, is a co-producer or a co-creator, or whether in the more extreme, although not without its problems, idea of critical use, even aiming at uselessness, right? As a form of anti-consumerism, anti-property type of movement. Now, essentially, the user is a degradation of, or rather, I meant to say, a gradation, a matter of degree of engagement. Some conceptions of the user in the actions of the and situations of the built environment are more active conceptions of the agent, the user, rather than others, and some quite, I think, remarkably in architecture, often enough, over the long period of its modernity, presents the user as essentially a passive agent, a mere consumer, if you like, of the already set up built environment. This is just to tell you that, in other words, the notion of use is prevalent in our everyday life, and historically, from the beginning of our so-called Western institutional formations, whether those be the idea of subjective rights, or whether it be the notion of appropriation, or whether it be in the sense of the political economic idea of the value of something, both in the sense of using it, but also in the sense of its profitability, its exchange or extraction, we could perhaps say in Marxist terms. So this is to say that the reason why I would suggest it's useful to focus on use, of course given the gift that Giorgio Agamben's genealogy and general work provides us, is not academic in itself, not historical in itself, but also actually quite pragmatic. Use is something we do every day, and yet we have, it seems to me, not thought about it enough. Or rather, let me reverse this, we have learned to not think about it, and for specific genealogical historical reasons. So let me now take you through a very brief outline of some aspects of Agamben's genealogy of the notion of use. Agamben becomes interested in the notion of use very early on in his writings and early studies. I don't have the time here to narrate to you, even in outline, how this develops through his work, but I want to focus on some of the key episodes that I think will help you understand Agamben's genealogy of use, but also where our inception with Aristide of use as a useful notion for our protocols project comes from. Now, the most famous, although for the most part, I think, outside of historical work, and perhaps to an extent the work of legal and political theory, or social theory, socio-economic even theory, often disregarded, but very, very important historically, is the early medieval long episode. I'm speaking of about 800 years of discourses, of fights between the Franciscan order and the Catholic Church. It begins around the early 13th century, and it continues all the way to at least the 15th century, the consequences of which, however, are relentless for an even longer period of time, and with many intended as well as unintended consequences. I will not have time to do justice to this, but I just want to explain to you some basic aspects of this that I think eventually, when we put them all together, perhaps towards the end of this talk and in our discussion, will actually help you see through the very problem that lies within the notion of using something. Now, the Franciscan order is a Christian order inspired by what we can call early Christianity, the idea that one should be a Christian in the sense of imitating Christ, quite literally. And hence, the ideology or the dogma of the Franciscan movement, at least for the first few centuries, is what they called apostolic poverty. The idea of being an imitator of Christ who lives in what they called in the Latin simplex usus facti, as you see on the slide. This is, in other words, claiming a way in which one can use something without any right to do so, both in the sense of not claiming any right over that something, not attempting, in other words, to appropriate it, to make it one's own, but also not in the sense of relating the action of using that something to the legal system that defines a particular social framework, and in this case, the framework of the institution of the Catholic Church at large, which has adopted a legal framework, both in the sense of the inheritance of classical and post-classical Roman law, but also canon law, divine law, natural law, all the laws that form the institutions that in the West, chief among which, don't forget, is the Catholic Church, or at least was for over 1,000 years, and effectively becoming the Holy Roman Empire as we know it. Now, there is something peculiar here, and I will return to the politics of this, but effectively the reason why Agamben turns to this historical episode is because there is something quite paradoxical taking place. The Franciscans, think of them perhaps, if you like, as a social movement, maybe something along the lines of the Occupy movement, although with not necessarily the same intentions. But they were really out to effectively destroy the dogmas that defined the Catholic Church. Right? Let's not be indirect about this. So the logic here is very much the logic of a movement of practicing what is conceived as true Christianity, the Christianity that arguably the Franciscans are saying the Church has distorted, and returning to the very basics of imitating the ethics and, if you like, the teachings of Christ as understood by the early Christians. So Francis, eventually becoming Saint Francis, who institutes this Franciscan order, argues for the idea that the Franciscan monks will be using things socially, economically, legally, and so forth, without, however, claiming or having any rights to do so. In fact, without any relation to the legal framework of the world as such. Now, it's a very long story, as I said, but have a look at something that has, if you like, a number of unintended consequences. First of all, notice that Francis uses, in the Latin simplex usus facti, a fairly technical terminology to justify what he is actually trying to argue for, the Franciscan order. And that in itself, the use of the discourse that is available to Francis, and in part it is related to a legal discourse, is of interest in itself. Now, in order to explain and justify this idea of using things without having a right to use them, something needs to do the explaining and the justifying. And it is very interesting that, in fact, the ethical vow of poverty that the Franciscans undertake on the basis of the teaching of Francis in the Imitation of Christ are based on an almost cunning device, which is the abandonment, as they call it, of their own will, the renunciation of their own will. Now, there is a lot that could be said in relation to this, and you have a quotation that perhaps provides an understanding of it, but effectively what really concerns us for our purposes is that the Franciscans actually see through something that in the juridical nature of the rights to use things, for example in terms of property rights over a building or an object or what have you, or indeed over one's own body, given that today we have reached the point, after a significant period of time of developing this, that we can speak of the property of the body. And of course the very idea of autonomy is based, our freedoms, our rights and so forth, on this idea of being able to appropriate one's own body. Now, what the Franciscans see is actually a technical, if you like, nutrient, or a technical presupposition in the very idea of property, and as such in the very idea of appropriation as an action. They must have thought, how does one acquire property? Right? And you can ask this question yourselves. You could encounter an empty house, which is something that squatters do, for example, and this is relevant here. You can break into the house and claim the house as your own abode, as your own place of livelihood. Now, this is, if you like, the mere act of breaking in and occupying the place, and you could, according to squatting law, as it is the case in most of our Western and not only legal systems, eventually, in the passing of time and the fulfillment of certain conditions, apply for recognition by the legal system of the acquisition of property in this manner. This is, if you like, an implied acquisition of property through what in the UK context we call adverse possession. Now, what the Franciscans notice is that the mere act is not enough. You also need a claim. But what is, if you like, a claim of recognition by the legal system? But what the claim presupposes is that there is something in the act of occupying a place that offers, that enables this idea of acquisition, right? If you like, it is something that formally expresses the desire to appropriate. And that, of course, is the device of the will. And this is a very peculiar thing in human history and in human discourses, because we, of course, take our idea of desires and willingness as a sort of innate, natural fact. And yet the device of the will is an artifice. It is not a notion that was around forever. It is a notion that is essentially instituted in various ways, and predominantly in this particular episode of how one can acquire a right to using something, and it finds its initial traces perhaps in the logic of an intention to appropriate that we have in at least late classical Roman law. Now, effectively, this becomes an exposition of what it means to have property in something. In other words, what it means to use something as or because of having a right to use it. And this is, in a sense, very interestingly exposed in one of the most famous treatises of the Franciscan proposition, which you see up there with some very famous Franciscans involved at the time between 1241 and 2, like Jean de la Rochelle, Eudes Rigaud, Robert de la Basset, and of course the chief Franciscan who was responsible for this treatise that attempted to explain the whole logic of the Franciscan idea of using things without having a right to use them, Godefroy de Brie. Now, to put it very simply, and this is something that we don't even think about anymore, already in classical Roman law, the idea of acquiring property was based on the verb appropriare, to appropriate in English, and of course in other European languages, essentially approximates the idea of converting a thing, res in Latin, excuse me, through the ability to will, to intend, to appropriate it. Excuse me. In other words, what the Franciscans expose is that in the juridification of things, in the creation of rights to use things, we have isolated something we call a thing, a building, for example, a motorcycle, what have you, and that the mechanism through which we can appropriate it, we can claim it as appropriated, as subject to our private property claims, as ownership, if you like, is what in Latin is arbitrii facultatem, which is essentially the device, the apparatus of the will, the power of willing something into one's dominium, and I will come to dominium in a moment. Now, I hope this is clear, and perhaps it is technical, but what is, I think, or I hope will become evident, is that the Franciscans essentially uncover something of an unintended consequence. If you accept that property is not a natural phenomenon, as Roman law proposes, instead it is, as Roman law proposes, let me clarify, intended into reality. It is enacted, right, through the will. The intention is necessary, otherwise you cannot claim appropriation of something. This means that property is not only willed into action, into legal sort of form and social, economic, and so forth recognition, but it is actually a thing, property, if you like. The notion of property is an immaterial essence. It does not have any naturalness. It does not have any automatic value to it, right? So it is entirely a human artifice. In a way, we have here in the debate that lasts for centuries between the Church and the Franciscans, and it should be noted that the Church initially endorses the Franciscan idea of apostolic poverty, and indeed the Franciscans eventually become the popes. A series of Franciscan popes is a major achievement for the Franciscan movement, and they lead the Catholic Church in various directions, as we may discuss when it comes to our discussion later on. But effectively we have, on the one hand, to put it very simply, the Church that claims you cannot possibly use something without having a right in it. In fact, this would be the classic liberal or neoliberal democratic state's defense of the right to private property, and the protection of the right to private property, even using violence against anyone who perpetrates to disappropriate a private property. And on the other hand, the Franciscans, who as a movement against property and against the legal rights that justify the idea of property in the sense of an exclusive use of something on the basis of rights, who claim that property is effectively a fantasy, a fiction, and if that is true, and this is the, in my view, cunning side, if not humorous side to this, then we can undo it. How do you undo it? Well, excuse me, if in order to acquire something you must use your will, you must show intention to acquire it, you can then, by logical consequence, de-appropriate something or not claim it as private property or as having a right to use something by renouncing your own will to it. And in fact, not only the will to appropriate that particular thing, but according to the doctrine of Francis, the will as such. There is no higher sacrifice, remember, as we saw earlier, than the renunciation of one's will. Why? Because there is nothing more powerful in a human being, at least that was the perception at the time, than the fact that one has his or her own will. What we would call today, perhaps, in a sense, our ability to act autonomously according to will. So the unintended consequence here is that property is effectively deconstructed using the very same tools of classical Roman law that constructed it. The fact that you need to show intention. If you withdraw that will, that intention, then so does the right to property disintegrate, or so Francis and the Franciscans claim. In this sense, the fiction is replaced by another fiction. The fiction of private property that you will into enactment, into action, is dissipated by the fiction of the renunciation of the will. A fiction that, if you like, renunciates the very fiction of willing as such. There is a lot that could be said here, but I don't have the time and I don't want to tire you and tie you down to the detail of the technical aspects of this, but I want to run very briefly through two of the key terms of the Roman classical, late classical discourse of rights, so that you have a sense of the terms that are used. And I'll be very, very brief about it, but I'm happy to discuss it in more detail if you're interested. The idea of property or ownership, we would say in modern terms, although dominium, which is the Latin term in question here in late classical Roman law, does not mean ownership as such. And I'm not going to get into the difficulty of translating dominium, but just for the sake of our discussions, we could say that dominium associates a claim to a thing, right? So it sort of represents an element towards the appropriation of something, as, for example, the way we would understand it today as a private claim to property, to being the owner of something. Now, again, a very interesting aspect of this is that one of the things that takes place in late classical Roman law is a device. Again, this is not something that naturally happened, but an artifice. It is an institutional creation whereby a thing, res, is separated from the various possible claims or entitlements one can have in relation to it. And I don't have the time to emphasize the importance of this, but it is perhaps the first time that we have separated things as if they are independent of our relation or degrees of relation to them. It might be that this is the root, for example, for the emergence of the autonomous product or produce. The idea that there is such a thing as the thing itself, separate from the labor that creates it, separate from the consequences it entails once it enters the market, and so forth. Now, interestingly for us, and this is why an ironic consequence of the Franciscan claim to use things without having the right to use them entails a legal paradox, is that dominium in late classical Roman law is defined according to three acts. There are three types of acts that define what dominium is. Usus, use; fructus, the fruit of something, as in the apples of a farm, the actual object of the production of apples, if you like; and abusus, disposal, distraction, or consumption, as I suggested earlier. Now, usus precisely is an element of appropriation, right? So already in the late classical period we have the act of using something, in one sense at least, and I will say something very briefly about that in a moment, as already a way towards which one can acquire property, right? So you see, one of the problems the Franciscans had was actually how to argue their own protocol, let's say, how to argue their own fiction, how to place it in words. And this is very much an experience I think we shared, and we do share in the work of the protocols, in that the wording itself entails its own problems, some of which perhaps are technically surmountable, and others which can only be surmountable if you place a fiction upon a fiction, or a paradox upon a paradox to the second degree perhaps. But we can come to that later on perhaps in discussion. Now, this is the basis for the late classical Roman rights to dominium. Use is included in them. So the Franciscans have the problem of how to argue of mere use without a right to having something, or having a claim, an appropriation towards something, private property in something. How do you say this idea of use that Francis had in mind without getting entangled or mixed up in the technical vocabulary of the late Roman, classical Roman law, that is, of course, also one of the key discourses of law of the time within the church and so forth. And of course, don't forget, it is the church who is in charge, right? This is a time when the Catholic Church is not what it is today. The church is essentially sovereign, the sovereign, right? The holder of law, the holder of property, the holder of moral principles, the holder of the executive branch of government, the judicial branch of government, and so forth. And eventually, of course, an empire. Now, I don't want to tire you with the detail of this, but in Roman law, we have at least 3 different types of use recognized by Roman law, and I'm not going to get into this now, but effectively none of them fitted the Franciscan purpose. And to even avoid the detail, none of them fitted the Franciscan purpose, because remember, the Franciscans are not only renouncing, say, rights to property, right? Like when they visit a village or a city and they seek to sleep somewhere for a few weeks, they are not claiming private property over whatever it is that they choose to sleep into or are offered to sleep into. And I would give you a couple of examples of devices that were used for them to be accommodated in this way. But not only they are not claiming private rights over that kind of property that they use, for example, but also they claim more generally to have no relation to the legal system as such, not only to the language of rights, but to the very systemic framework that defines the actions of pretty much everyone else and everything else in their society, and in a sense ours as well. So it is very interesting that at the level of discourse, but also at the level of practice, the Franciscans had a real problem in front of them. And perhaps it is not something easily surmounted to our minds, but it could be, I think, sort of conceived if you think of the relatively recent legal trouble that the Occupy movement around the world ran into in the recent times, at least, when they claimed the right to occupy something in the name of social justice and so forth. And of course they ran into legal problems because what they were occupying was not actually available to their occupation, legally speaking, right? And there is a lot that can be said as to that in relation to social movements and their action as such, and also the right to break the law, which has a very long history in relation to this. But this is not really our own focus here. Now, I mentioned that I would give you 2 examples, and 2 of the examples that the church itself eventually, but also the cities that the Franciscans visited, came up with were essentially fictional devices, very much like the protocols that Aristide and I conceived in the work that you're aware of. One of the devices conceived and proposed and accepted by Pope Gregory IX around 1230 with the Bulla Quo Elongati, and ironically the Bulla is a law, right? The law of the church, so it declares a device to accommodate a claim against the law in legal terms. These are the paradoxes that I think we have to think about also in relation to the form of the protocols work that we do with Aristide. But essentially the fiction, the device, is the amicus spiritualis, which is the idea that as to, for example, the Franciscans staying overnight in a city at a house, the logic is that friends spiritual friends of the Franciscans volunteer to offer their property to the Franciscans for free without them having to be involved in any kind of exchange or contractual promise or rental and what have you, right? Later on, another device was that when there were no volunteers and there was, in fact, the Franciscan movement, remember, starts with something like, think of a model of Christ and the 12 apostles. Francis initially has a few friends and disciples around him. Eventually, the Franciscans are a movement that grows in their thousands, and then the tens of thousands, and then the hundreds of thousands, all the way to effectively becoming the majority of the Catholic Church in their various denominations. Now, if no volunteers are available, the Church volunteers itself to become, if you like, the holder of the dominium, the holder of the ownership right, so that the friars, the Franciscans, do not have to hold a right, to hold whether individual rights in relation to the property where they stay at, or even communal, collective property rights. The Church, if you like, facilitates this need of the belief in apostolic poverty of the Franciscans through its own fictional device that they become the owner of a place where the Franciscans are staying. Now, I have probably tired you with the technical details of this, but what I'm trying to illustrate is that things are indeed socially and legally, and of course morally and economically complicated. There is no such thing as a simple claim. Remember, the term the Franciscans use is simple use, as a matter of fact, simplex usus facti, not as a matter of right, but as a matter of fact. Right? I walked into a home and I stayed as a matter of fact, without claiming or without having any right or any permission for that matter. Now, to cut a very long story short, the Franciscans lose their major argument. The idea of apostolic poverty as one where one has no right to use something, but one merely uses things without rights, is defeated. And it is defeated in some way actually by the Franciscans themselves. But of course the major victory is that of the Church, right? Pope John the 22nd, if you like, declares the definitive defeat of any argument that attempts to bypass the language of rights, or the language of private property, or the language of collective property, or property in general, and law as such, by the fact that not only there cannot be, he argued, and Pope John the 22nd was a very well-trained lawyer, among other things, which is of interest as well here. Not only one cannot use something without having the right to use something, so in other words, to put it very sort of blatantly and simplistically clear, the Church will not allow the Franciscan monks to do whatever it is they like to do without first recognizing whether what they intend to do is permissible or not. It is the Church that will have control over the use of things, and the right to use things is the language and the mechanism through which we can divide, or the Church divides, between what is permissible and what is not permissible, what is legal, if you like, and what is not legal. Now, on top of that, Pope John the 22nd, this is a very interesting episode for the history of how we have been thinking in the Western imaginary of morality. Until that time, there were various competing ideas of justice, right? So while, for example, the church could claim that one cannot claim to use something without having a right to do so, the Franciscans could respond to that by saying, well, yes, but this is under human law or under canon law, the church law. What about natural law or divine law? The law of God allows us, the Franciscans in fact argued, to use something by renouncing or denouncing human or canon law, because divine law in a hierarchy of laws is above all other laws. Surely the law of God is of a higher value and dominant over other types of law, including, of course, the law of the church and human law, or what today we call civil law. But the Pope, John the 22nd, is cunning here, because what he in fact begins to deconstruct is that image, which perhaps you're very familiar with, that the Pope is not just a person. The Pope is a minister of God. In fact, on earth, the Pope is the, if you like, representative of God. Therefore, the word of the Pope and the logic of the argument of the Pope, and by extension the law of the Church, can determine what is a just act, right? Not just what is a right, legally right act, but also at this very top level, of the divine idea of justice, the justice that the God himself in the Christian imaginary dispenses on earth, is determined by his representative. So we have here one of the very interesting elements of a long history that leads to our contemporary understanding of the division between the spiritual and the secular, right? Which is a division that is born out of, interestingly, that very initial move by the Catholic Church and Pope John the 22nd to claim for himself as Pope the right to determine what is right? The right to determine what is justice, right? Which until then was not a prerogative of a human or the Pope and the Church itself. So the Franciscans are defeated because even if they could find a way to denounce the use of something as a matter of right, and to claim this thing that they've been arguing for a long time with the Church as to using things without having a right to use them, even if they were to find a way successfully to claim simple use, mere use of facts, even then they will be defeated, the Pope declares, because that would still be an unjust way of using something, right? Because of divine justice as represented by the Church. So, a long story, forgive me, but in fact what the Franciscans were aiming at was perhaps more familiar, or is perhaps more familiar to us if you think of contemporary social movements and critiques of capitalism or neoliberal sort of governance. They aimed at a de-juridified way of living. They aimed to be indifferent or neutral towards property, private rights, and the legal system as such. The irony, of course, or rather the paradoxical difficulty, is that they could only do so in an attempt to enable their idea using the discourse or the discourses that were available to them at the time. And in all the contexts of the discourses that were available, the law was prevalent. And in fact, excuse me, very interestingly, one of the later formulations of the doctrine of apostolic poverty, of using things without any claim to having a right to use them, is by Hugh of Dean, who expresses it in his Expositio Regulae as hoc ius nullum in his que transeunt ius habere, which is in translation this right. So in other words, they're saying what we, the Franciscans, claim is only this right, the right to have no rights. Right? And this is something also that Giorgio Agamben and others have focused on as an example of the difficulty of arguing against, say in this case, private property rights, when the language that defines what it means to act in relation to things in general is already preempted, already formalized and institutionalized by the juridical paradigm of understanding action in the world. So in other words, for me, what is interesting here, and perhaps for us in our wider conversations in relation to your own practices in architecture, and also the wider practices of social, politico-economic, political activities, is precisely that it's not only private rights that are at stake. It's not really just about, could the Franciscans or squatters today occupy empty buildings when so many empty buildings exist in our privileged societies, as it has become quite well known in recent years, because of overconsumption, because of over-appropriation, where people have 3 or 4 or 10 homes and they don't actually use them, while at the same time people live on the street, destitute and so forth. Before we even go into these discussions, there is a wider problem that one has to encounter, which is perhaps not something that was obvious at first, and it is actually one of the key benefits, in my view, that we acquire through Giorgio Agamben's genealogy of use and his philosophical work more generally, which is to realize that the very idea of action, of acting, has been defined in this juridical framework to such an extent that we cannot think, whether we like it or not, whether we observe it to be so or not, in any other way than in this juridified way of living. Yeah? And the language of rights is one element of it. Now, it leads us to consider, I will skip over the question of a state of necessity. We can return to that in later, if you like, discussions. But this is to say that it's not only action or acting that is defined by this juridified way of thinking of things and of human action, but also the very idea of being as well. Essentially, what Agamben is telling us is that we have defined being, our very existence, and also our logic of acting or enacting something according to a particular logic, the logic of transcendence. So in effect, what is at stake in Agamben's genealogy, to put it very briefly, is a clash, as he says, of two different ways of thinking ontologically, of thinking of our existence, our mode of existence. Transcendence and immanence. Now, of course, there's a very long history in Western and not only Western philosophy that is in a way summarized by adherence to either transcendence or immanence, or attempts to mix both and find sort of bridges between the two. But essentially, the model that Agamben is critiquing through his work is that of the model of transcendence. And transcendence understands using something always as a matter of right. And the way to understand transcendence here, and to put it almost topologically, if you like, given our interests, is that there is a split between the action and its consequences. That is the technique of the device of transcendental right. So, for example, you can physically live in a house that you do not own or intend to own. You can break into a house, or you can be staying at a friend's house, etc., etc. But the physical action of actually occupying, possessing that house for the moment and for the duration of your stay is completely separated from the rights of another over that house in terms of ownership, legal ownership. You can be on a holiday, say you own a house and you go on a holiday, you still own the house when you're not physically there. Again, this is an example of the obvious split between the mere action and the transcendental, if you like, external right or form that this action is dressed up as in the legal sense of the right to property. When you look at someone, to put it in a more humorous way, standing outside a house or on the threshold of the door of the house, you cannot tell if they are the owner or not. Right? The mere physical activity does not tell you if they are the owner, the holder of the form of rights over that property or not. Again, the split between the mere action and the legal qualification or quality, or what we call form, as such. Now, this transcendental rightness has, of course, economic consequences, and the very obvious logic in which Karl Marx separates in his critique of the capitalist economy use value from exchange value in order to explain exploitation and domination is precisely through the split between a mere use, in this case labor, and the exchange value, the market value that one acquires, the profit that emanates from a particular product, etc., once separated from the actual cost and not the cost of merely waged labor that puts the work needed, the action needed physically, and not only physically because of immaterial labor as well, that is needed for the production of that thing, whatever it may be. So the value of the house you own is actually not dependent, not determined by the action or the actions of designing and building it and the labor that this involves, but in terms of the economic value, political economic value of the market that grants it, if you like, that is acquired by market processes, separate and separable from the builders who built your house, the architect who built your house, and your own self as the owner-in-law of the house. Now, opposed to this idea of usus juris, to generalize it, the right to use, having a right to use, is usus facti. Now this, while in the Franciscan attempt it failed, and in fact not only it failed, but when the Franciscans took over the church, they became perhaps the worst sovereign masters of the church, worse than the ones they criticized. And that is an irony of political consequences in itself. We can debate that, if you like, later on as well. But what the Franciscans, and that's why their paradigm is useful even though it failed, point to is a logic opposed to transcendental right. A logic that does not wish for the thing and the subject to be split. Yeah? That does not wish the mere fact of doing something to be split from whatever qualification is acquired as a basis of that action, or as a result rather of that action during the use of something. This is a logic of immanence, right? Philosophically speaking. Now we live in a logic of transcendentalism. Our legal systems, our moral values, our very understanding of our being and existence, and our, if you like, relationship to the built environment and to the environment and the planetary environment at large is a relationship of externality, a relationship of transcendence. In other words, in order for us to act and to be, we are, as a matter of formal institutional necessity, in need of relating to the environment, relating to the built environment, relating to things and to others. Now, this necessitation of a relation, which philosophically we could call a negative relation, right? Because it purports to take something away from whatever it is that we are made of, whatever it is that we are as beings. It presupposes that there is something in us that can be split from whatever it is we are. This logic is the dominant logic, a logic of extraction, a logic of acquiring relations, which in the long scheme of things of Giorgio Agamben's long multi-volume series known as Homo Sacer, showcases its legal, political, ethical, philosophical, spiritual perhaps consequences. Now the Franciscans are useful in this frame of Agamben's work because they help us think about how to, if you like, deconstruct this idea of transcendentalism, this idea that we are effectively split personalities, right? So what I actually do is one thing, and the qualifications that the law, the market, my sort of behavioral relationships at the level of the emotional or the spiritual provide or qualify these actions with certain characteristics, certain qualities, certain values, that these two things can be separable. Immanence, in contrast, argues that these things are not separable, right? That in fact there must be a way for us to conceive of ourselves before transcendence was or became the dominant modality of our existence, that splits us between the mere physical act and then whatever legal, political, spiritual value we give or is given to that act, whether in terms of rights or in terms of economic value, etc., etc.